as everybody knows, I'm John Atack. It's a well-known fact. And this is my dear friend and colleague, Joe Szimhart. Hi, Joe. How are you today?
Hi, good to be with you again, John.
Mm.
And I noticed you have background noise of one of your artworks there, which is nice.
Yeah, I've
It's
moved
a
some of
pleasant.
the pictures from in front of it, some of the photos that it.
So but that's good because it gives me a lead in because we're going to be talking a bit about art
Mm.
and the mess that art got me into.
Yeah, very
It wasn't
dangerous
just
art. The children should be warned not to involve
this should be
themselves with
warned,
art,
not to
just in
be
case.
careful. There's lots of rabbit holes in the art movements out there.
And how?
So this is I just reviewed this book. It came out a couple of years ago for IXA magazine, and I'm in the middle of getting it edited. But it's over 600 pages, and it's called Nicholas Roerich, or Roerich is one pronunciation, um, The Artist Who Would Be King. And it's by John McCannon. He's a scholar, and he did about 10 years of research on this. There's 100 pages of notes, and of whatever sources and everything that he used for this, and it's quite good. Now, the story for me is this guy Rourke. When I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1975, the first day I was there, um, I was in a gallery, and an elderly gentleman was running it, and we became quite good friends. But he had this American Artist magazine there, and it had a feature article on this character, Nicholas Roerich, this mystic. And I read the article, and it was a fairly positive spin on him, 1975. And I was intrigued, and I began to follow up on this. And when I went back home, back east to visit, I went to New York, and I visited the Roerich Museum, which is at 107th and Riverside in New York City, in Manhattan on the west side. And they were very nice to me. The head of it at the time, Sina Fosdick, she was elderly, and she passed away like in 1983, I think. But I met her in 76. She had met Nicholas Roerich and Eleanor Roerich, who started this movement called Agni Yoga, AGNI Yoga, around 1920. And she was a young woman at that time, maybe 19, 20 years old. And she remained a firm believer in the whole thing, what you might call the Agni Yoga cult, until I met her then, and was still, deeply into it until she died. So she was a total believer, very pleasant. I bought some Agni Yoga books. She answered all my questions. She had a very thick accent, sort of Russian. And I would write back and forth to her. What happened was I met some people in Santa Fe, New Mexico around the same week when I first arrived, who were part of the Church Universal and Triumphant group, and they had just gone to their first conference and come back. It took us about a year in our relationship for them to open up what they were into, because they saw it like a secret society. Some elites only belong to it. You can't just tell anybody you get into this. And there have been rumblings, out there already in 1976 that this was a cult group, the Church Universal. But they found out that I had been reading these Agni Yoga books, these mystical books written by Eleanor Roerich, Nicholas's wife. Helena had gotten into Theosophy when she was very young, as a teen, and also started doing something called automatic writing, which is a form of channeling, allowing the spirit to communicate through her.
Can I just add a little note there, which is that Ron Hubbard in the book Dianetics, the Evolution of a Science, admits that automatic writing was a method of research that he used. So very popular, very popular.
He was a bit of a Johnny-come-lately, because this was already going on in the late 1890s,
Absolutely.
And Helena Roerich just started doing this around 1900, 1905. When she began reading Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine and Theosophy, she was very intrigued with the whole thing. And she felt at some point around 1919 that Moria, Blavatsky's master, one of the masters, the three biggest were Kutumi, Moria, and Dwakul. Well, Moria began communicating through her through automatic writing, and thus began the Agni Yoga mystical teachings. She met Nicholas Nicholas was intrigued with her. She was quite stunning. She was a beautiful young woman from a high, high-bred family in Russia. And Roerich came from a white Russian family. She was also white Russian, meaning they were more pro-nationalist and anti-communist in the beginning, that type of Russian. And he went to art school. He did very well. He was pretty well known. He was among some of the radical painters in those days, but he never crossed over into pure abstraction like Kandinsky and others did. He stuck with the illustrative, almost an Oriental flair to his work, like Gauguin. And in fact, some people called him the Northern Gauguin, in terms of his style. So they got together, got married, and they began this Agni Yoga Society thing. They left Russia and they were also in Germany, came to the United States and began to gather followers in New York City and then in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and on the West Coast. Roerich had a national tour of his artwork in the United States at the time. And everywhere they went, they would meet people and begin setting up this mystical group based on the channelings of his wife. And part of the belief system, which is interesting, and this book brings it out, because he points out that Roerich was very influenced by this book, Beasts, Men, and Gods, by Ferdinand Ossendowski. All right, so Ossendowski was a Pole and Polish, and back in 1920 he escaped Poland, went down through Mongolia and whatever to get away from, the persecution that was going on at the time, because Stalin under Lenin was beginning to. Anyway, there were after people like him that were white Russians and Poles, and he tells his story of his escape. It's an interesting autobiography. It's very fanciful, but at the end of it, and this is 1922 when this comes out, at the end of it, he gets to this place where he meets the living Buddha. It's in this chapter here, the living Buddha. Huh. And it's this blissful garden of 1,000 joys. And he meets this character, and he gets initiated into this kind of a Buddhist sect, back then. And he meets someone that calls himself the king of the world in the last chapter here. All right, so, and he talks about this, and he writes about it in somewhat cryptic lines, but he says here on page 126, they received information from this character. I'm not going to pronounce his name. It's something like Huruku Jelab Jamsrap in this town. He told me the story of the semi-realistic arrival of powerful king of the world from the subterranean kingdom. That's Agartha. That's the world underground of where all these initiates live. These Buddhists and great masters live, which became a later legend, among a lot of theosophists and whatever. Blavatsky wrote about it to some extent.
You've got this sort of like the Shangri-La myth, haven't you?
That's exactly what came out of it. Yeah, exactly. But it was called Agartha. And then he said that the king of the world from the subterranean kingdom, of his appearance, of his miracles, and of his prophecies. And only then did I begin to understand that in that legend, hypnosis or mass vision, he brings up the question, but he allows you to make the decision, whichever it may be, is hidden not only in the mystery of a realistic and powerful force capable of influencing the course of political life of Asia. From that moment, I began making some investigations. All right, so he plants this powerful suggestion, and he makes it sound like it's highly possible. Well, Roerich, this is him. This is a painting of Nicholas Roerich by his son Svetoslav, who was also a great painter. So Roerich, as a young man, took this to heart as something quite real and possible. Eventually, through the Agni Yoga connections and wealthy people that he was able to gather around him, his inner circle never ran over 20 people, and he had a tremendous amount of influence. with the second layer of disciples and third, you know how that goes. There's an inner layer. The inner
The
layer is
influence
only
continuum.
right. But the inner layer, they had secret code words and all this kind of stuff. You know, they called each other different names. Believed that Roerich and his wife were going to be relocated at some point, find this Agartha, which is, you know, more in the Altai Mountains, and he would take the role of the king of the world. This was their great secret all throughout his life. He died in 1947. Helena died in 1955. So most people that study Roerich don't know that about him, that mystical side and all of this. But this book here, you know, brings it out quite clearly. And when I read this is like a late edition that came out some years ago. There's been many editions of this Beastmen and Gods. In this late edition, they decided to put a painting by Nicholas Roerich on the cover, which is interesting because Roerich had nothing to do with the book. But, you know, because of his mystical life or whatever, it makes a lot of sense that the secret is kind of hidden, that painter is the king of the world mentioned in the back of this book. You know, anyway, it's fascinating to me to get into the inner works. The other part about Roerich that's brought out in this book, and which I knew, is that in the late 80s, Roerich began to gather a great following again in Russia because the Soviet Union was falling apart, and Raisa Gorbachev and Mikhail Gorbachev were both Agni Yoga members.
Oh, right.
And you know, and so around that time, there was a great influx of people getting interested in this. An Agni Yoga Center was like a big museum, and this author, John McCannon, describes the Agni Yoga Center that was set up in Moscow with the help of a Ukrainian shyster who was a wealthy banker, and the Gorbachevs. And he said that, you know, when you went into that museum, a Roerich museum, which had his paintings, it was also set up like a monument to him. It was as if you went into a Scientology center. You know, not many people were there, but it had this mystical quality, and it had like the presence of the leader still there, like his artifacts, and, you know. Well, eventually, Putin, let's get up to Putin here. Putin's ex-wife was also a follower of Agni Yoga. Okay, and he divorced her, but the Russian Orthodox Church, because Putin wanted to keep in good graces with, because it has a lot of power in conservative Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church deemed Agni Yoga and all of Theosophy as a satanic movement, and so Putin pulled away from it. The Agni Yoga Center, the Roerich Center in Moscow, was moved to some obscure street somewhere else, and it doesn't have any of the power it does. And so Agni Yoga has been somewhat repressed now by Putinism, you know, the way it is today. There are, however, an estimated 3 million Russians that are Agni Yogis. It's by far the largest of the theosophical sects that's in terms of interest and whatever. Yeah. In America, you never hear about them. Like, for instance, I was in this Agni Yoga thing in 1975, but, you know, even when I got out of Church Universal and all that cult stuff in the 80s, when I was researching cults, I never heard of Agni Yoga mentioned in any sociology group about cults. It just didn't come up, you know, and I had gotten to know 2 Agni Yoga cults that were separate from the main group in the United States. They were both quite small, maybe 40 members and 15 members. One was run by a guy named John Baptiste up in New England. And Maddie Tobias and I did a workshop for 30 ex-members of Baptiste's cult when they discovered he was a multi-generational philanderer, you know, having secret liaisons with women and manipulating people. And they all finally realized that this thing's like a cult, we need help. And so we did a 2-day workshop for this whole group of ex-Agni Yoga members that were part of Baptiste's cult. One of the great followers of Baptiste's Agni Yoga group was Alan Arkin, who wrote a book, Halfway Through the Door. an autobiography of his involvement in the group. He doesn't mention the group. He keeps the leader's name secret, but it's quite clear from the cover, which is a Roerich painting, that he was part of an Agni Yoga group. Eleanor, he had his whole family in it. The whole family was involved in Agni Yoga.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the family members was at our workshop. You know, so it's fascinating. The other impact that Roerich had was what's his name? Henry Wallace, who was the Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt, FDR. And while he was Secretary of Agriculture, he came across the Roerich group, and he immediately got invited to the inner circle because he was into all this stuff. He was a Freemason. He was into channeling stuff. He was into mysticism, you know, so it was an easy recruit for the group to get him in. So he was their most powerful government influence in the US. As a result of his influence, Roerich got into, even FDR was somewhat accepting of Roerich, you know, a little bit. Eleanor Roosevelt was into this stuff. She was into Theosophy, into the Alice Bailey teachings. And Roerich was in the conversation among all those people, you know, so it wasn't unusual among the elites in politics to be into this esoteric stuff. You know, not all of them, obviously, but quite a few. So in 1935 or 34, the government of the U.S. sent Roerich and some scientists to the Far East in order to get seeds and plants that could be planted in the U.S. to rejuvenate the Dust Bowl, because we had that incredible drought down there that led to the Great Depression partly. Yeah. You know, and to Grapes of Wrath. It was written by Steinbeck about the Dust Bowl. So Roerich was supposedly going over there because he knew something about the East, according to Wallace. Well, these two scientists that went over there with him began complaining to Roosevelt that this guy doesn't know crap. All he's interested in is going to monasteries and looking up these secret mystical things. And they got really upset. Well, Wallace had these two guys fired, and Roerich went along with this very expensive trip for months around there, and hardly did anything of value in terms of science and bringing plants back to the U.S. But in the meantime, while he was there, he ingratiated himself, he got to Moscow, back into the Soviet thing, and he told them he thought Lenin was a Mahatma. After being anti-communist, he now became pro-communist. So Roerich was a bit of an intriguer, and his fellow artists would call him a poseur, you know, because he was into promoting himself in order to become what, you know, geopolitically the king of the world. And most of the people that met him on these trips, like, you know, the British consul, for instance, in near Tibet, because Roerich also went to Tibet to try to find the secret place of the masters, the Shangri-La, Agartha, whatever you want to call it. Of course, he didn't find anything. And the British consul there thought he was a spy, a Russian spy with his caravan, and held him up for months. Quite a few of the animals died. And then finally, he allowed Roerich to come visit him. Roerich didn't know that was the guy that actually caused all the distress, holding up his caravan. And so this British consul talked to Roerich, and he realized this guy's just a delusional character. He's not a spy at all. You know, nobody would trust him to be a spy. He's just into this comical, cosmic esotericism, you know? And so that's how most heads of state in Japan or whatever saw Roerich finally. You know, he was more of an illusion of a powerful man, and he wasn't really, you know, in any real sense. All right, so Wallace ran for vice president later under the Progressive Party, which was leaning, you know, socialist in the U.S. The press got a hold of the Guru papers that one of the ex-members of Agni Yoga leaked out to the press. The writings between Wallace and Roerich, which are real fanciful and crazy, and they called them the Guru papers, and it was released to the press. And it caused somewhat of an embarrassment to the government and to Wallace, who had tried to put Roerich behind him. And of course, Wallace lost. He didn't win presidency. But what's interesting is this, and this is what the book brings out. Had Roerich not met Wallace and FDR, FDR would have kept Wallace on as his vice president for that last term.
So he would have been president when Roosevelt died.
And Wallace was pro-Soviet. He was anti-war. We might have never dropped an atom bomb on Japan at the end had Wallace taken over. I mean, think about how that would change the world right now. So in a very ironic, twisted way, Nicholas Roerich, through his cult influence over someone high in government, set the wheels of history turning a different way. You know, it's fascinating to think about how impactful this kind of stuff can be at different levels, because government people are influenced by this kind of thing. They have weird beliefs, you know, as we know. And
sure.
yeah, I mean, you know, you look at somebody like Elon Musk. I mean, he's out there with some of his ideas, you know, but he still is a very powerful man. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, and you have people like Steve Bannon, you know, involved with Rene Guénon's teachings and that kind of thing. And even Dugin, that influenced Putin in the earlier days, was into Rene Guénon. And Guénon was a contemporary of Roerich. And what's interesting is Roerich, Guénon, and Gurdjieff, who I kind of looked at as a triumvirate of esotericism when I was into this stuff, all had their roots in Blavatsky's Theosophy. All three of them. They went their own ways, you know, and with Guénon even criticizing Blavatsky quite a bit, even though he more or less reinvented a similar esotericism based a little bit, you know, more on Islam. But this book was fascinating, and I did a review more or less explaining what I just said. But what was even better was coming across this beast, men, and gods, and how that myth of the king of the world influenced Roerich and then influenced the subtitle of this book. You know, how that kind of impression somebody can have. And one more interesting thing I'll bring up. When Roerich, before he got married, he was in Paris. And he was fascinated with seances, which everybody was at the time. They were all over the place. And he decided he would go to one. And this medium that he was there told him something, you know, that he had been planning and had told nobody, right? You always hear this stuff. And he was in awe that came up during the seance. You know, I don't know what the specifics were, but that was the experience, you know, the experience that moved him toward that realm of occultism that later led to his wife being in Theosophy, and he was a complete believer in her connection to Moria, and what Moria was telling him, that he was a great man, you know. So it was like mutual flattering going on here, and or we could use another word, but
we could.
But let's just be kind.
It's not.
So, but what's interesting is you know, my question in my review was, is this man, was he heroically cosmic or heroically comic? You know, and then I go on with my review, and you know, punning a little bit on Kierkegaard's statement about Hegel, that if his system was just written as a thought experiment, it would be one of the greatest systems ever thought up. But in as much as Hegel took it seriously, he was merely comic, and that was Kierkegaard's word. And Roerich took himself very seriously, took this occultism that he was into very seriously, and so did his wife, despite all of the headaches it caused them personally, which it did. They got banned from the United States. They ended up in northern India, and practically in exile in this beautiful place, but they couldn't do much up there, called Urusvati, up in the Kashmir area. And he passed away up there. But so, yeah, it was a fascinating read in that sense. But the fact that you know, he was just like any other cult member in a sense. usually someone that gets involved, especially the occult type of charismatic groups, they have an experience, whether it's of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, or oneness with the universe. They're down in the Amazon taking ayahuasca, and suddenly it all makes sense, for a split second, and they want to hold on to that forever. And then they start writing autobiographies and appearing on talk shows and whatever, touting their experience.
We have talked about Eckhart Tolle elsewhere.
Well, that's another one. Yeah, this personal experience, this sense of the endorphins begin to fly, and you really feel great, and there is no death anymore, and you have all these resolutions that come to you, during that. So it's interesting that kind of experience could lead to this kind of life, and you have to look at it and say, well, the guy did a lot. He did a lot of damage, but he did a lot. Now his paintings, I want to bring one last thing up, his artwork, which was kind of criticized or whatever, but he was a pretty good illustrator. He was good with color, and you have to give him that. He had a good sensitivity for what he was doing, and he could paint rather quickly. Today, a decent Roerich painting sells in the millions of dollars. Yeah, so there you go. So if you'd have collected him, you'd have had something. He allegedly did around 7,000 pieces of work during his lifetime. Some of them were lost over time. But anyway, that's him, the artist who would be king.
It does bring up so many fascinating thoughts, and this essential idea that the movers and shakers in the world, the leaders, the people who change history, as Truman changed history with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that they are influenced by beliefs. Truman, as far as I understand, was a kind of down-home Christian. He had a fairly straightforward attitude.
Yeah, he was kind of homespun.
Yeah. And, even to the point where his parents gave him his second name, S. That his second name was S, Harry S. Truman. It didn't stand for anything. It was just an S. It was nice to put in there. But we will always bring our beliefs with us. And so when you find out the convolutions of this, it is incredibly important what people believe. Belief is the software that we run on. And when you interpret the world in a particular way, then you will see, you create systems that function from that. I'm told that the Dutch at the moment have possibly the most right-leaning government with their new elections a couple of months ago. And it is greatly influenced by anthroposophy.
Interesting.
The work of Rudolf Steiner, who also, of course, came out of Theosophy, was involved with ritual magic in a group that Aleister Crowley also belonged to, and created a system which I lived close to, because I used to live in East Grinstead, which is the headquarters for Scientology in the UK. But 5 miles away, you've got Forest Row, which is the headquarters for the anthroposophists. So I knew a few of them. I had a good friend who was an anthroposophist. And it's a kind of system of weirdness imposed. So, I mean, if we talk about art, if somebody has been to the Tobias School of Art, the Steiner School, you can always tell,
Oh, yeah, you can tell Steiner work. Yeah.
Goethe's system of color, which opposes blue to yellow instead of violet to yellow, which is the more accepted one, though Kandinsky and Gauguin both had the blue to yellow thing as well. But it also, if we look in the arts, the neoplasticism, Schoenmakers, who is, again, a theosophist, and who is Pete Mondrian's tutor, and who is almost never mentioned. And the influence in the arts of Mondrian, the idea of non-objectivity, that an abstract work, to be abstract, cannot be interpreted in any way as representing anything. So you end up with 2 black lines, a white rectangle. Also, the idea that art should not require any technical skill, which is fundamental to Mondrian. Now, this, it seems trivial and stupid, but it actually has influenced all abstract painting in the last century, that there's this kind of hidden rule that it mustn't look as if there's any space in it. It mustn't look as if there's any movement in it.
Well,
You're actually restricted down to this.
that was Tom's Wolfe argument in 1975. It was later published a book called The Painted Word.
Yeah.
And he said that the critics, that were following this trend since the 1912, 1913, that ultimately the god of art was flatness. It had to be flat. It had to be surface, and that was it. Anything, it wasn't a window to anything. It was just what it is. Like tar on the street. And that was the goal of Barnett Newman and all those people.
Yeah, and yeah,
even Rothko to some extent, flattening out the cloud feeling, but it was still what was on the surface.
Yeah, St. Francis, Maurice Louis, wherever you go, that there's this kind of biblical truth that, as you can see from what's behind me, I don't hold to this truth. And I think you can make a painting that is purely abstract and not be worried about what people might see in it, or,
Sure.
where it might lead them, that you can actually dive deep and look for the purity of color and form and line. And I've spent a lifetime doing that and haven't made the same amount of money that Roerich made. So I obviously have the wrong doctrine.
There you go.
So then looking at the whole cultural complex of what is and isn't permitted, so we now end up with, pretty much Marcel Duchamp did everything you can do. Conceptual art, surreal art, Dada, he's there before the beginning of Dada. Op art, pop art, ephemeral art, the use of semen in his work, of course, which we don't really talk about.
Well, there's a piece in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, one of his constructions, where you have to go through a peephole and you see a naked woman down there with, and this feeling of something glistening, like it is suggestive of an orgasm, is what it is.
Well, a piece, of course, he also committed the ultimate act in 1923. He retired, which artists don't do. But he hadn't really retired for the 40 remaining years of his life, as he sold off the collection of Hansarp sculptures that he bought the whole show. And he ran out and he had to start making little copies of the things he'd done earlier. But he was actually producing, of course, he was producing other work. And there was a piece that he sent to a woman in South America that was analyzed, and they found that it was actually produced out of semen. So he did directly use that. But we find now so many poseurs, I'm afraid that's my view of Tracy Emin or Damien Hirst or Jeff Koons, who are basically not really adding very much to the world of art. And we find, I saw a great documentary a few years ago, and there was this kind of warehouse owned by a billionairess, and she was walking a camera crew through, and she said, "Oh, mind out for that." And there was a pair of sneakers, what we call trainers in the UK, which had been sprayed silver and nailed to the floor. And she proudly said that she'd paid $10,000 for them. And we have gone into the emperor's new clothes. We've gone into this world where it is the mysterious meaning that is significant. And sadly, the people,
it's like a continuation of what came to be called conceptual art.
Well,
which really was, there was just words and suggestion of something there behind the wall, and you had to conceive of it.
Yeah, and I have no problem with conceptualism per se. I think Maurizio Cattelan is a truly brilliant artist. I just don't think most of the people, and if we go back to Bruce Nauman and the origins of conceptualism in the early 60s, where the idea was, it's all Robert Motherwell. It's all these enormous things that only the super rich and museums can have. Let's bring it down and let's make it something you can't sell. That's where Nauman started. So you had installations where you'd walk through plywood sheets and stuff.
So you had to go to the museum to see the thing.
Yeah, you had to go to the gallery to see it. But then we got ephemeral art where you'd arrange some leaves on your lawn and take a photograph, and which is all great, and some beautiful things have been made there. But painting itself was hobbled by this belief system, by this way of looking at things.
You know what's interesting? You're talking about the elite of the elite, the big collectors, the important shows. that happen in select cities around the world, Dubai or whatever. And when I think of the art world, there's so much more going on. And when you look at it locally, like regionally, because I exhibit in regional shows where I am here in a small gallery, and most of the people still paint representationally. They kind of do awkward faces and awkward landscapes and, awkward interiors. But they have fun with it, and they sell a few things here and there for a few $100s maybe. And then there's always a few artists in any region which stand out. They do better barn scenes than anybody else, or better animals than anybody else, and that kind of thing. So that part of art is really what the common man experiences for the most part, and is affordable. When you're talking about what we were just talking about, the high galleries, the museum level work, that's almost politicized, as to what's important and what isn't. Just before we get off here, I want to show you, this is one of Roerich's bigger landscapes in his mid-career. You can see that here.
Yep.
Yeah. So he's pretty good. He knew color, and it had a sort of a
You're blocking your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. It had a bit of an oriental flair to it. And then he did these mystical kind of paintings. This is called The Mother of the World, and he did variations on this, including one. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was done, a version of it about 15, 20 feet high as a backdrop for some cathedral, some place that a wealthy woman wanted to decorate with that. Roerich, of course, went beyond Mother Mary, which is more or less the Madonna theme, into a more esoteric Mother of the World, Mahatma, ascended mistress, whatever, kind of a figure. But his followers believed that his paintings with their color combinations had curative powers, that you would have this emanation of healing from them, and all of that. So there was a lot more to his work and his color. Kind of like Steiner in his paintings. You think that there's some mystical quality to them if you're really into Steiner. And his idea of the super sensible world. The Agni Yoga people would call it the psychic vibrations. That they would use that, but it was beyond the normal senses and others. So, but that's intriguing what you told me about anthroposophy influencing Denmark's politics.
Holland.
That is weird.
Yeah. And I think that, the wider point can be made and has to be made that the influence of a belief system is real and live in our world today. So if we look at, because I've been digging around in Charles Manson's life, it's brought me to a study of apocalyptic ideas. Now, the word apocalypse means revelation. It doesn't mean Armageddon or a great destructive battle. But when you start looking at history, you start seeing that certain sets of beliefs come true. So one of the ones that many years ago fascinated me was the prelude to the First World War. That in Britain, somewhere over 400 novels were published about German spies and saboteurs before the war began. The only one that remains is Erskine Childer's Riddle of the Sands, which is still in print, I believe. I read it when I was a kid. Don't remember anything about it. But there were more than 400 novels talking about this. The term the Great War was first used in 1911, 3 years before the war started. And when you then shift over, and because I was absolutely obsessed with Vasily Kandinsky and Franz Marc, August Macke, Paul Klee, absolutely obsessed with the Blue Rider Group of 1912. Yeah. And as I got deeper and deeper and read their writings, I found a wonderful book, which I've not been able to find again, and there are several other books with the same title, called The Apocalyptic Vision, which showed that at that time, in 1912, the German-speaking world had a quite different belief system going on. First of all, they didn't believe that the British were infiltrating them and spying on them. I don't think there were any German novels about this or novels in German. They did, however, believe that they were more developed than any other culture. You know, you have the beginnings of Nazism, of the Übermensch, Nietzsche's Übermensch, already there. And indeed, there was an American observer who visited the German High Command in 1915 and was very worried about the kind of pseudo-Darwinian ideas about them being the elite. But there was also this idea that there was a coming apocalypse. Kandinsky wrote about it. Mark wrote about it. It was a common.
Well, Roerich wrote about it. He wrote about it in the 20s and 30s. This was part of Agni Yoga, that there were 3 major apocalypses going to happen, and World War II, of course, came about without them predicting exactly when, but there were these inclinations in the teaching something was going to happen in order to purge the world, and then the king of the world would arise. Of course, no king of the world came out of it. The kings got dethroned after World War II, basically, or that type of ultra-nationalism did for a while.
Yes.
But then the Agni Yoga people in the late 40s and 50s still held on to the idea there was going to be another conflagration. And it was predicted in Roerich's paintings or whatever. So they're still waiting for that to happen, much like Jehovah's Witnesses are waiting for something to happen over and over again, you know, or conservative evangelicals think something's going to happen in their lifetime, you know, and the Christ will come again.
In looking into end days beliefs, and I've gone back and looked at the Jewish apocalyptic, the Hellenistic apocalyptic, the Zoroastrian apocalyptic, not in any great scholarly way, but I've acquainted myself with these ideas. And what we see is a set of predictions for the future that are ever refined. They change from generation to generation, and every generation, as far as I can make out, has had people of influence who believe that they are the last generation, that it's all going to end. Now, it's airy-fairy nonsense until, of course, we say, well, that would include Ronald Reagan. That would include George Bush Sr. That would include George Bush Jr. And if we start moving off into possibly the most dangerous cult in our society, which is the family, the International Christian League, which started the prayer breakfasts in Washington.
Oh, that
it'll happen. And we have, where have they gone? Jeff Charlotte's books, The Family and C Street, which I think everybody should read, because we're talking about an active software, a set of beliefs that a huge amount of politicians in the Christian and Muslim worlds have accepted. When they're having these high-level conferences and praying together, and you find beliefs there. I mean, the most dangerous belief is I think it's Romans 2, the second letter to the Romans, where you have this notion that God appoints all the leaders of the world. So members of the family, leaders of the family in the International Christian League, have put forward this idea that we should listen to the teachings of Hitler and Stalin. Both of these things are taught to young interns in Washington. And you're going, hang on a minute, where are we going with these ideas? To give a simple example, in the 1930s, when Palestine was a mandate as part of the British control, Alexander Wavell, who was the head of who was the head of the British Army in the Middle East, which was a very powerful force, you know, through modern day Iraq and what have you. He took a man called Ord Wingate, who would later become very famous for running the Chindits, the group that went into the jungle in Burma against the Japanese. As a kid, he was, you know, along with Stonewall Jackson and various other people. When you're 8 years old, you don't have a deep perception of history. These were military heroes, so they were my heroes at that age. And Wingate, you then find, was actually put by Wavell to train. I don't remember whether it was Irgun or Haganah, which of the Hebrew terrorist groups, but he trained them in terrorist tactics from the British Army. And the little bit that becomes fascinating is he was a member of the Brethren, the exclusive Brethren. So he believed that all of the Jews have to go back to Zion, to Jerusalem, to be converted, and then Jesus will come back. And you're kind of going, so you're telling me that international politics has been run based on the idea that Jesus might be coming back, and everything is skewed. So, as you say, if Wallace had become president, he probably wouldn't have done what Truman did. And of course, just a little footnote, but Truman, in the War Cabinet meeting where he decided to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, he says, this will show the Russians what we have. Because the other bit of that story is that what the Russians had an army of 1.5 million that was on the edge of Manchuria, the Japanese province in China, ready to go. And Truman was worried that they might take that part of China. And so you've got all of this geopolitics, all of this stuff that we are not told about. But much of it, many of these people belong to nutcase groups, and they are imposing their ideas upon us. And this it's bizarre. When I, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, started wondering about the Nazis' involvement with occultism. And I was told by historians that this was irrelevant. And I'm kind of going, but if they believe this stuff, then I heard that Churchill had an astrologer because he knew Hitler had an astrologer. So he knew what Hitler was being told. And then you find out that, Hess, Himmler, on and on through the German high command, the Nazi high command, they were ritual magicians. They were practicing this nonsense. That Himmler had his Schloss with his table for the Knights of the Round Table to come back to, and he believed he was a reincarnation of the Heinrich. So it's what we believe is how we'll behave, and this is forgotten. This is Goodrich Clark.
This book, Black Sun, Richard Clark. This was more important to the Nazis than the swastika was. This symbol. This was their inner circle. Symbol.
And it's an exceptional book.
It's very good.
He's a professor. He was a professor. He's not somebody who's making stuff up. It's all very well sourced. No, and of course, he also wrote about neo-Nazis in America and the movements that have come out of the various belief systems, where you have the Viking neo-Nazis and the identity Christian neo-Nazis. And all of that is tied into Theosophy and the Aryan nonsense that Blavatsky created.
He's very good because he understands the mechanics and the social forces behind this, and doesn't write them off as extraneous. They're actually, like you said, they are part and parcel of the way that human beings act and think. We want to believe we have occult power. And I tell people this, and they don't understand what, most people think they have psychic, they pick up psychic things through their dreams, through making connections, correspondences in the environment. So we have a tendency to want to believe this stuff. And when you get a powerful leader with some charisma that encourages it, it's easy to gather people around them. It's easy to gather a cult around those kinds of beliefs. It's not that hard. And as you know, and I know, there's thousands of groups have formed in our lifetime based on those kinds of notions, that some leader has deeper insight into the mind of God or the mind of the universe or whatever, whether they use their own mind or some astrology chart or, it's very tempting for human beings to want to believe that. It's part of who we are.
Yeah. George W. Bush said publicly that God had told him to invade Iraq. God told him. And that's kind of worrying. And it gets more worrying. There was a survey, I think it's about 20 years ago now, of atheists to see what they believed. And they found, it was a fairly sizable survey, 80% of atheists believed in magic. They don't believe in God, but
No,
they
no.
do believe that if they can concentrate hard enough, then they can levitate or, whatever. So the belief in the supernatural, I think, it's close to hardwired in us. I think we do have the
No, I
capacity to
think you're
overcome
right.
any of our programming, but
No, I think you're right. I think it's uh from our earliest experiences in art, the great cave art from 40,000 years ago in Spain and France and
yeah.
who knows where else. Um, I just finished this book called The Mind in the Cave,
Mm.
and it's somewhat Marxist oriented in the sense that it looks at art from a secular viewpoint, but as produced by, not by some independent muse that influences, but produced by the biological organism of the brain, which, you can't argue with it too much, but it's this book here called The Mind in the Cave, John.
Okay.
Yeah, The Mind in the Cave. It came out in 2002
Mm.
by this guy, David Lewis Williams. And his theory is that, and it makes some sense, that these ancient peoples that crawled into caves, they imagined themselves crawling into the womb of Mother Earth. Their mother, they knew enough to know they came from this, like all animals do, that in other words, they believed in Gaia before Gaia became a thing. They were
And they might be crawling anywhere up to 2 miles through
way
corridors
deep
to
into
get
these
to
things,
these.
and then putting these paintings and scratchings on the wall.
Mm.
The theory in this book is that they probably went in either under an altered state of consciousness, which you would be in one anyway, crawling around with torches in a cave like that, or they might have taken the substance, or who knows, or maybe they were drumming, or maybe there were some gases in the cave. I don't know.
Mm.
But the image he has here is that this seer, this shaman, would look into the walls, and the animals would emerge from the shapes in the wall. They would later impose with paint over that shape in the wall. So if you study cave art, it follows the formation
Yes.
of what's there. It's not just slapped on like you do a wall painting, like a mural. The cave interacted with the painter, with the artist, with the shaman. And of course, they painted what? Their totem animals, which they're already connected with magically, which were bison and stag and bull and lion and whatever. And every now and then there would be a man depicted. And some of the humanoid figures that were put had these like lines all over them, like jagged lines. The theory is that when someone is in ecstasy of some kind, like a shaman might be, your skin tingles. And to represent that is these energy lines they would put around, So the theory in the book is that was the origin of art, in a sense, of painting, was a shamanic experience. And it was rather pure because they had nothing else to go on. This is just what they saw and did and used whatever skill they had, which was quite advanced when you think back. Those paintings are magnificent, those bison and
Yes.
a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are.
Some of them are incredible.
But there's different segments of the caves have different functions because they would, like you say, go back for miles or hundreds of yards. There were some entry areas that looked like they were more for group experience. You could recreate the feeling of being around that mystical shape, that energy of the animal on the ceiling or whatever, through whatever, drumming, chanting, which they probably had back then. But that's really the Mind in the Cave talks about that experience. And, and I think that Roerich, in his way, or Roerich, as they pronounce it in Russia, he wanted to bring that back also, to bring that energy back into his paintings. So I don't fault him for that. I don't think that's an awful thing he did, except that I think what happens is it becomes overvalued. He used it to increase his power of influence over certain wealthy people, that his paintings had this magical power. And, and then the question comes up, how much magical power do they have? Well, it depends on your personal experience, or it depends on how enlightened you are. Does the emperor have clothes on? again, you know, so that's where the problem comes in, where the ancient cave people probably weren't into that kind of manipulation. That was probably pure experience. Well, for one thing, you know, the art didn't go to them. They had to go to the art. They had to crawl into these galleries at personal risk. And there was no one taking money, you know, at the gate to get them in. And, you know, so in a way, this all ties together for me, but it kind of shows who we are as human beings, as artists. You know, we're still trying to make sense of what the environment is influencing us to think about the environment. You know, what is it? What's that spiritual component? You know, why do we keep painting? Why do we keep, you know, illustrating things? Why do we keep making movies with these fanciful, you know, magical formations and adventures on the screen? You know, and again, you can go back to Greek theater. Why did the Greeks have these emotional reactions to theater? You know, the idea of a catharsis.
Yeah.
Right. And we still continue to do that because obviously the ancient cave artist was creating a catharsis for someone that went in there and magically saw these animals emerge with their flickering light. You know, the animals probably looked like they were moving on them, you know, and it could have been quite an extraordinary experience back then.
Yeah. I mean, the Vestanici, which was a settlement about 25,000 years ago. Last time I read about it, it may have moved its date. Things do sometimes. And there's a famous so-called Venus, fairly portly woman who belongs to that period, who belongs to that place, Vestanici. I'm not sure whether it's in the Czech bit or the Slovak bit. It was Czechoslovakia when I was reading about it. And they found a hut that was separate from the village. And they found remains of, you know, the ashes and the cinders of fires. And in them, they found little carved or molded clay animals. And when these animals were analyzed, they found that each one had the fat of the particular animal it represented.
Wow.
And, you know, without getting too Joseph Campbell on anybody, what you have is the guy who's the artist, or the woman who's the artist, whoever the artist is also probably the healer, probably the religious shaman, the figure who is interpreting the world for people and, you know, saying whether the rains will come. And all of this is fixed in this one place. Those things, I don't know if Roerich's paintings have any healing qualities, and I think getting down into the little bits of vibrations, but certainly great art has a profound impact in terms of awe. I remember going into the Prado a couple of years ago and seeing Velázquez's crucifixion. And you know, James Joyce said there are three kinds of art. There's the kind that attracts you, which he called pornographic, that which you want to own. He didn't mean anything about it being to do with
like voyeuristic.
Yeah, that you want it. And then there's the kind that's didactic. It's trying to teach you, and that's repulsive, most conceptualism. You don't, you know, you want to escape. And then he said there's the real stuff, and that's transcendent. That's when you can't move. It's in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And I had, you know, it's that experience when you see something magnificent and all of the words go away, all of the descriptions, all of the being in time goes away. You have cosmic consciousness or what have you. We want that experience. Watching a great movie. I mean, I watched Synecdoche, New York the other week with Philip Seymour Hoffman and written by Charlie Kaufman, who also wrote Adaptation. And it is something that has so often been tried to try and get into the creative psyche and express it. And it usually ends up with waiting for Godot or, you know, absolute boredom and dejection. And here you have a fascinating insight into it. And I came away feeling vitalized and refreshed. Same way with, say, you know, American Beauty or It Happened One Night, you know, with Clark Gable. There are films that they get through to you. There are works of art that get through to you. And you feel something magical. Now, here I am going to get Joseph Campbell on you, that I think he was right, that our past shamanic beliefs, our priestly beliefs, where priests read books and tell us what to do to keep with the rules, we are potentially in an age of creativity, where the attributions of religion, spirituality, and magic are things that we engage in directly by making and perceiving art, and by not being silly about it, what it might do. And I think art definitely is healing. I don't think, on the other hand, and I'm an abstract painter, I am, but I don't think that Jackson Pollock has any healing qualities, having seen all of the major Pollocks, and up until the point where I saw them, believed they were great works, because they're this big in the book. But then you see, was it Blue Mist, Lavender Poles, Blue Mist, I can't remember, somewhere around there. I looked at these things having, I was in my nearly 50 by the time I saw them, and there was absolutely nothing happening. You just got this guy.
What's interesting? You bring
paint,
you bring up Pollock. I think the big mistake in displaying Pollock, especially the ones that he painted on the floor, was not keeping them on the floor.
Yeah, I was saying this to somebody just last week.
Display them on the floor, you get the idea of maybe what he was feeling, what he was doing. On the wall, they don't make as much sense.
I think you also need to drink 2 bottles of whiskey, and then if you're suspended above them in a Singapore sling, you probably get the idea of what he felt. But and in again, that Clement Greenberg, the incredible amount of CIA money that went into destroying the Takists' reputation in Paris, so that it would look as if New York had got something new. It hadn't, and it wasn't really important. But again, it shows this desire to influence through culture when you realize how much Hollywood is integrated with the FBI, that for years they've had advisors working in Hollywood. This is not a conspiracy theory. They're one movie after another, they've had the influence of the US military to keep them on message. And when you go back to the First World War, you get George Creel and the Ministry of Information and the 4-Minute Men, who would, at the end of movie productions, 1917, 1918, they would stand up and spontaneously all over the country give exactly the same speech about patriotism, So you have this control of thought, the control of art, and of course, advertising. It's just art. That's what it is.
Well,
these art gone nasty.
I can understand the impulse behind it, because obviously an organized bunch is much more powerful than a disorganized bunch. So if you can, like Plato said, if you can create the noble lie that organizes the polis, the city, then you have a good city. But it's really, we've talked about this before, but how far do you carry that? How tight are the controls over the people that don't quite conform to your ideas? And what do you do about them? That's where the question gets kind of weird.
Well, I mean, Plato was very determined about that. You put the poets out. You get rid of the poets. We want to be philosopher kings. We don't want any bloody poetry. And you put little girl babies on the hillsides to die, because who needs them? He had his own idea about that. But it is true. How much of the secret should we reveal? And in this scientific age, is it actually safe now to let people think, to let people have the facts, to let people make decisions?
Well,
or
John,
do we keep producing this nonsense,
I worked in a psych hospital for 25 years, and I still am part-time. So some people, you can't just let them think anything they want, because, if depending on the actions that the thoughts result in, can be very harmful to themselves and others. So there is a limit.
Yeah, but the point is that if the politicians, who I'm sure are the people you're thinking about here, were put into the psychiatric institutions, then the world would be at peace. If we could take some of the people with these lunatic ideas. I'm currently reading Rory Stewart, Politics on the Edge. Stewart was a minister in various conservative governments here in the teens of the century, and he stood for the leadership against Boris Johnson, and sadly didn't win. And he basically explains that now, to become a politician, you have to tick off all of these boxes that say, I've campaigned this much, I've knocked on these doors, I've never been a member of the Labour Party. It's all about what you've contributed to the party. And you're now, he was a guy who'd been a diplomat, he'd been out in Afghanistan running charities, he'd just had an amazing career. And it's only by accident that he was allowed in as a politician, because he didn't have the qualifications that are now required, which has actually left us with a completely sterile politics. So in the US, it's like pro-Trump or anti-Trump. That's about where we are. So, and this is down to the influence of beliefs and ideas and our willingness to be certain, this thing that William James made such a point about, that we have feelings of certainty. We know that Donald Trump's a good man, or we know that Joe Biden's a good man. I don't think either of them are good men. Sorry. I think they're both despicable human beings.
Well,
but you only have the choice of one or the other. So which one are you going
anyone
for?
that's gotten that far in politics is already, has been smudged quite a bit. There's no way you get to that level. But
would that it were otherwise. I mean, I was surprised to find out that Barack Obama was using very much the same tricks that got Trump elected. So for his second election, he too was diving into Facebook and using niche marketing and stuff like this.
Oh, no, definitely. In fact, the GOP learned a lot of lessons from the Obama campaign, and they had to reorganize how they ran their, so in a sense, Obama being younger was a little more facile and willing to, he had nothing to lose. He could use the modern technology and influence games that the old GOP wasn't available to them yet. So,
and of course, the first important person to use Cambridge Analytica was Nelson Mandela. So,
there you go.
What do we believe in now? So yeah, belief, very important. What else have I got?
So it's interesting to me, maybe another topic sometime could come up. Is it possible that AI, because it's really getting more and more advanced, the mind of the artificial mind, will come up with a universal belief system that people are going to buy into? Is AI going to become our God? That's a question. Some people think that's coming.
Yeah, I'm very hesitant on that subject, and have been for a
we
long
all
time.
would be, but the point is that AI is learning how to make sense to human beings, and I'm putting sense in quotes. That, in other words, you give it 15 words and it creates a novel, and it makes sense. That's where we are with this. We give it 15 words and it creates a theology, and it makes sense. This is where we're going with this, and it takes quite a keen mind to outwit. I mean, there's nobody can beat AI chess player,
or even a Go player, which is a lot more frightening than chess.
More, yeah,
that it can play Go.
So when you get to that level, what else can the average person is helpless? How are they going to discern whether it's a novel written by a man or a robot? We don't know that at this point, but I do think that it's possible that to be objective, keep the human mind out of it, and allow an algorithm that seems rather sophisticated and fair to everybody on Earth come up with a new concept of theology, religion, devotion, cosmic consciousness, whatever. I can see that starting to be offered up more often.
Which is fascinating. I think most essential to this is, will AI work out how to persuade human beings? Because
that's what I'm talking about, because it is persuasive, because it's so sophisticated.
Yeah.
Just the sophistication is persuasive to most human beings, and it answers questions facilely. It can have layers of arguments to your objections, and with a few layers, 2 or 3, most people go, okay, it sounds like you're right. You see where I'm going with this?
I do, but one of the things that concerns me is that not only is there no ethical framework surrounding AI, despite years of demands for it and people like Elon Musk signing petitions for it
Yeah.
while buying up their own AI firms. There's not only no ethical framework, but what we saw with Zuckerberg and Facebook is extraordinarily possible in the current climate. Facebook, they sat down at college and said, how do you persuade people? How do you compel people? How do you get people to want this? How do you get people to give us all of their private information so we can sell it? Facebook, by the time it was stopped, had sold all of its information to 45,000 corporations, according to Brittany Kaiser, who sold Trump on the idea of Cambridge Analytica. So the next level is, if you take what we found out about persuading people, because the cults, the authoritarian cults, have their systems for persuading people. You and I, in a very small, a couple of handfuls of people around the world, worked out how to unpersuade people. Now, I am concerned that the techniques of persuasion and exploitative persuasion, I'm going to default to Margaret Singer's term of art because it's still the one I prefer, that exploitative persuasion can be entered into large language models, into artificial intelligence, so that people will be persuaded. But will they be persuaded of something useful? If we look at, say, the way Marxism rose through the 19th century and the conflicts and contradictions which are fundamental to Marxism, I must say it's never been attractive to me, because I read that Marx had said there is no such thing as a bloodless revolution. And that went against my nature completely. I'm sure there is such a thing as a bloodless revolution. Well, you can persuade people without killing them,
But this is what I mean about AI. It can create a bloodless revolution by persuasion.
Yeah, I'm absolutely agreeing with you. Yeah.
When you think about the Roerichs, Helena being the channel, and Nicholas to some extent, they're tapping into this other world, which is very real to them, and it has its own agency. The Mahatmas, the White Brotherhood, they have their own agency in their mind. So they're only like mediums or scribes, much like Muhammad had a scribe. He was the angel was the agent of God. He was the agent of the angel, and the scribe saw Muhammad as the agent of the information, and he was writing it down, right?
Yeah.
So you had three layers of agency. The same thing with Eleanor Roerich, there's the ascended masters or Moria, and they are tuned into a higher consciousness with other names or whatever. And so it kind of gets filtered down to the human brain level, and then humans enact it, so it's a hierarchical system. So does AI now become that agency that we look to for prime information, and will we call that God? That's the big questions coming up.
And it's happened. It's happened in Silicon Valley and we find, I mean, a couple of years ago, a close friend of mine came to me delighted to have found that the tech whizzes of Silicon Valley were not allowing their children to have computers. And he said, and they're sending them to these schools, Waldorf schools. And I'm like, oh dear. So instead of them being brought up in the digital age, they're being brought up in anthroposophy. And so there are people there who have tremendous power, i.e. money, who have come to believe that the singularity is God, and that teleologically we are headed towards the point where this will solve all of our problems. And of course, we will talk about this some other time because it's so complicated. But you have this idea of a human utopia at one end, or of, well, pretty much the Time Machine by H.G. Wells at the other end, where the people will come up from underground to eat those of us who live overground.
John, overall, personally, I don't see anything new in this. I'm not that excited about AI any more than, I was by the smartphone or camping.
You weren't excited by the smartphone? Good grief.
Yeah. I mean, I had to learn about it. It's very complicated, and I still don't know how to use the thing.
Mm.
But I think it's easy for every generation to get way ahead of itself in terms of what we were accomplishing, because biologically, the biomass of the human hasn't evolved a whole hell of a lot since those cave times. We are still Homo sapiens. We invent a lot of crap, a lot of interesting stuff. We expand ourselves into outer space, where we probably don't belong, but who knows? Uh, the, the whole adventure is quite exciting, much like going into a cave is exciting to explore for the first time, and so, but we are still this vegetative biomass, Homo sapiens, and generation to generation, as we generate ourselves, we are going to change a whole hell of a lot. We might get a little fatter and less strong because we're less inclined to be survivalists, as we used to have
And the
to be.
Morlocks will come and eat us. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyway, I got to get going. Let's leave it at that.
Well, let me give just one final thought, which is that
I'll leave you the last word.
Thank you. I believe that we experience cultural transmission, and that our ability to change and become something new is way more developed than it was when our species first came along. Yes, we have the same biomass, we have the same brains, but we have accumulated through language and through storage systems of different kinds, writing, printing, computers. We now have access to a great deal more information than we did before. The problem is we're still stupid. And that's the bit I think we are going to have to get over.
Okay.
And that means that we need to consider our beliefs and be a little less fanciful in allowing people like Nicholas Roerich to, have command over our minds.
No, I agree. I think you're right. I think it's our appetites still override our intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, this is always a
good.
pleasure. We'll do it again.
All right, John, thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.